Welcome to Voices of the Community, which explores critical issues facing Northern California communities. We introduce you to the voices of community thought leaders and change makers who are working on solutions that face our fellow individual community members, neighborhoods, cities, and our region. This is George Koster, your host. This episode is part of our series exploring COVID-19's impact on nonprofits and small businesses in the San Francisco Bay Area. Back in April of 2020, when we decided to create this ongoing series on COVID-19's impact, first on nonprofits and then on small businesses in the San Francisco Bay Area, we, like you, had no idea how long the pandemic would go on and what the health and economic impact would be on our community. As we enter our second year of the global COVID-19 pandemic, with record numbers of both cases and deaths, our schools, businesses, and governments are still struggling to deal with the health, economic, mental, and societal impacts of the latest Omicron variant. This all adds to the ongoing uncertainty of our ever-changing indoor and outdoor, vaccinated and unvaccinated protocols, and the politics of the pandemic that will drive how we all come back together as a unified or fractured community. We will continue to shine a spotlight on the nonprofits and small businesses that make up the fabric of our community, along with the founders and staff who are struggling to deal with the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on their operations, services, and sustainability until we can all get to the other side of the pandemic. Along the way, we will also share with you all the amazing solutions that our nonprofits, small businesses, foundations, and government leaders are working on to help us all get to the other side of the pandemic and come together to rebuild our communities with more economic, social, and environmental equality.
I think that housing is just fundamental and unfortunately not really a right now in our country. And it's something that we need to work very hard to have more of so we can all be healthy and we can all have the kind of lives and the kind of communities that we should have in such a wealthy country that has the values that we say we do.
This is the Executive Director of Resources for Community Development, Dan Sawislak. Since 1970, California has not been building enough housing, especially affordable housing. The latest estimate of California housing shortages ranges from 3 to 4 million housing units. This decades-long lack of housing impacts both the estimated 160,000 unhoused Californians and the 7 million Californians living in poverty because they spend over 50% of their paycheck just to pay for rent. The state's official housing production goal is 180,000 units a year, but the state is only building around 70,000 units per year. It is with this background and context that we wanted to feature Resources for Community Development and their holistic approach to not only building affordable housing, but providing wraparound services for their residents. I'm joined remotely by the Executive Director of Resources for Community Development, Dan Sawislak, and the Director of Community Development, Brianne Gala, along with Resident and Secretary of the Resources for Community Development Board of Directors, Katie Giles. Welcome to Voices of the Community, Katie, Brianne, and Dan. I'm going to ask each of you to provide a little background, and I'm going to start out with Dan first. Just give our audience an overview of Resources for Community Development services and programs.
Thanks, George. So Resources for Community Development, RCD for short, is a nonprofit housing developer, owner, and operator. We've been building affordable housing and operating it since 1984. Our office is in Berkeley. We're currently working in 5 counties in the Bay Area. Basically, our mission is that we build, create, and preserve affordable housing for people with the fewest options. We build community and enrich lives. And we really have 4 main program areas. One is the construction of new housing and preservation. So that's actually real estate development and building housing that's affordable to low-income people. We build housing for a real wide variety of different population groups, including seniors, working families, people coming from homelessness, people with disabilities. We also operate that housing. We have over 60 developments that we've built in about 25 cities. So we make sure that the housing remains in great condition and really works well for its residents. We also provide social services for our residents, services to help them really enhance their quality of lives. It could be any number of things. Health services, could be counseling, just many other social kinds of community building programs. And we also have a community development department, which is what Brianne heads up. And that's really the work we do with communities that are surrounding our housing developments.
Thank you. It's a good overview. And Brianne, I'm going to turn to you and ask you to dive a little bit deeper because you are Director of Community Development. And I think within that, your kind of suite of services is also your resident services, which from what I can gather also ties into community development.
Thank you for the opportunity to be here. Our CD's community development work really reflects our growing commitment to greater impact in the communities where we have housing and services for our residents. We have been focused really deeply the last few years in the unincorporated communities in Alameda County. We started that work in 2015 when we worked with the county and local community organizations to develop Ashland Place. It's this great affordable housing building that also has a market hall on the ground floor that supports low-income entrepreneurs in the area. So building on this effort and on all this momentum, our CD launched a pilot in 2017 to really address the comprehensive community development needs in the Eden area in the unincorporated part of Alameda County. So we've been focused on everything from placemaking to health programs to building people power. And we're really working alongside community members to drive this positive change in the unincorporated communities. So that's a bit of an overview of our biggest initiative in the community development department. We also have, as you brought up, a resident services department. Dan talked a little bit about the type of work we do there. We have a really big commitment to making sure that our residents are supported with living healthy, stable lives. So Dan had mentioned a lot of our work to support their health. It could also be connecting them to jobs, to job training programs, educational programs, support they might need with their children. So some of our buildings, we have youth enrichment programs, and we're really basing that on the needs of the population and really trying to meet them where they're at and make sure that we're trying to provide wraparound services as much as possible.
Could you expand a little bit more on the kind of social engagement and community development component of the resident services and your leadership development program as well?
Sure. So I guess there's two ways to think about this. So within the community development work, within this pilot that we're working on in the unincorporated communities, we have a leadership development program. We're really working to develop more leaders in the community. This is a community that had very little community capacity, very few local organizations and grassroots groups. This is a community where over 75% of residents are people of color. And so we started off that work by launching a 6-month leadership development program that really brought together people across the community to really develop their skills, to help them launch community-based campaigns, to help them get involved in civic life in a different way than they had previously. And so we have been doing more and more work in that space, and we really are excited to be doing more and more community organizing and leadership development work. And then within our resident services department, which is a sort of separate department from the work I do, we also have a big focus on building community at our buildings, encouraging residents to get to know each other, to participate in activities on site. And as part of our growing focus on diversity, equity, and inclusion, we are also going to be working to launch some leadership development work that really helps encourage more of our residents to get out there and to make a change and to be involved in both their building and, like Katie, be involved with RCD and with the leadership of RCD.
And staying with that for a moment, you mentioned the entrepreneurship program. Could you help clarify, does that program help community members within your building or in your community help start businesses that they might have, or from a hobby transition into a business?
Yeah, that's a great question. At Ashland Place, there's this market hall where low-income, actually food entrepreneurs are able to launch businesses. And one of the things we found when we started working deeply in Ashland and in the unincorporated communities is that a lot of people were running home-based businesses. There are a lot of immigrant and undocumented families in the community who maybe have been excluded from traditional lines of work, of course, find a way to make it work and are really resilient. And so we partnered with Mandela Marketplace and with Alameda County's Economic and Community Development Department to launch this market hall that really provides space for 4 different entrepreneurs to launch their businesses with the idea that they're building their capacity and then moving on to hopefully open a more permanent business elsewhere in the community. And so we really see this as a great opportunity to use our commercial space and our affordable housing development to both support our residents who now have access to this great resource and healthy food options, but also to really use it as a place to launch local entrepreneurs and support the commercial corridor.
Thank you. You have a complete suite of services there. And I just wanted the audience to better understand that the idea is not just to provide housing, but you're really trying to provide wraparound services, everything from health and wellness services all the way to helping someone to go from a hobbypreneur to an actual entrepreneur. Turning to you, Katie, could you share with the audience a little bit about your process of becoming a resident and then participating on the board of directors?
I was in Alameda County building the Agency on Aging, and I happened to see a flyer that said an apartment building was opening up in Berkeley. So I says, well, I'm turning 62, so I'll apply for it just as I get 62, because you had to be 62 or older. So I was in Dallas and I mailed my application back. And by the time I got back, it was coming for an interview. And in the last of November, I was called and I came in for an interview with the manager, and I was selected to get an apartment. I moved in on December 10, 2006. It's when I first moved into the Margaret Breland homes. And it has really been great just living there. I knew nothing about RCD. They had a grand opening in February, and one of our past board members, Ray Vasconcelos, thought that I was great. I spoke at the opening and she says, oh, we need her on the board. So they interviewed me for the board and I accepted. So I came on the board in 2007 and I've been a board member ever since. I've gone to various speaking engagements for RCD, including going to speak on the steps of the Capitol in Sacramento for the redevelopment funds. It was a pleasure, and it was so enlightening to do something like this. I'd never heard of board members having this much access to the company.
Had you ever been on a board of directors on any, whether it's a nonprofit?
No, I had never worked, not as a member of the board of directors, but I had worked closely with a couple of companies in Dallas with their board of directors, and they were nonprofit organizations. One was a volunteer organization, and we would go out and speak to groups about volunteering in places like the Association for Retarded Children, the Association for Deaf, Blind, and like that. So I was used to the volunteer part of it, but I had never served on a board. So with RCD being a nonprofit, it was not completely new to me working with a nonprofit.
And it's very nice to see that the organization is bringing a resident in to participate in the governance of the organization itself. Dan, coming back to you, I'm going to ask you to take more of a bigger picture impact and then go back to Brianne and ask her to provide a little bit more granular impact about how COVID-19 and all of its variants has really impacted resources for community development.
It's quite a question. I could probably go on for quite a long time, and I try to boil it down a bit. But the beginning of COVID is now quite a while ago. Really looking back a ways, and I'll tell you, it was challenging. It didn't feel desperate, but it felt really unprecedented for us because the first thing we all, of course, had to do was to begin to work remotely, which, of course, was a big shock to the system. But then I think we were really quite concerned about the health of our residents. We house almost 5,000 people, and people were getting sick. There weren't vaccines. We have senior buildings. We have buildings where people come to work with our residents. And so one of the things that we really spent a lot of time doing was to initially make sure that our residents were as safe as possible. The rules of how people interacted in the buildings changed. We had to take staff out of those buildings that were some of our services staff that would normally work one-on-one with people, and that happened remotely. So there was a whole health component. I think another big component for us was issue of jobs and rent. All of our residents pay rent, and many of them are working people who had jobs in service industries, things like restaurants, et cetera. A lot of those jobs went away. And how would our residents pay rent? And we knew we weren't going to evict anybody because they weren't able to pay rent. That's something that we wouldn't do. But how would we support our residents and then support our buildings? Because without those rents, those buildings could run into some issues just operating. So that was a real concern for us. The last thing I'll just say, and this kind of goes to the real estate component of what we do, is that, we had some ideas about what COVID was going to do to real estate and construction. And I think that it really went in a completely different direction. We all felt that prices might go down in the market. Fair market rents could go down, or in the market could go down. Maybe it would be easier to buy sites and buildings. The opposite happened. things got more expensive and construction costs just have gone up tremendously for us. And we're now dealing with all the supply chain kind of issues where the cost of lumber is, far higher than it was 2 years ago. The cost of systems that we need for our buildings just to be able to get them. You can't necessarily even buy things like refrigerators or get them delivered on time. So because we do a lot of things, the issues and the impacts are, tremendous. And of course, we're still in it. Things are changing all the time and we're trying to adjust on the fly. I would say that it was challenging. Also, we learned a lot from it in terms of how we function.
Thank you. And Brianne, how has it affected your programs and your actual services that you deliver?
So I'll try to answer this on the services and community development side. On the services side, as Dan mentioned, we weren't able to provide services in the building in the beginning, but we definitely remain committed to our residents, and our services team and our partners were actively reaching out to our households multiple times every week via email, phone, and on-site to help them with applying for and receiving benefits, negotiating rent relief, finding food pantries, and providing much needed emotional support throughout the pandemic. And then on the community development side, all the issues that we've been working with really just dramatically increased in severity due to the pandemic. In the unincorporated Eden area, where our department's largely focused, at one point, residents were struggling with a nearly 25% COVID-19 positivity rate. That was in January of 2021. Unemployment at one point topped 20%. Housing costs went up 12% in 2020. And then we found that a lot of our immigrant and undocumented folks in the community were excluded from applying for local, state, and federal relief efforts. So we have been incredibly busy since the pandemic, really trying to make sure that our communities are housed and fed and cared for. I think while also really trying to address the systemic and structural issues that really allowed COVID to spread so rampantly in predominantly Black and Brown communities where we're working. And so I think trying to find some balance between helping people with their immediate needs is just always a priority for us, while also taking a look at some of the bigger picture advocacy that we need to do to continue to address the systemic inequities has really been our focus in the past almost 2 years.
And staying with that, Brianne, we started to come back over the summer, and then Delta exploded, and it seemed like people were coming back. And then now we have Omicron that's now hit. How has it impacted folks who are volunteers or vendors or partners that are helping you deliver the services?
Yeah, I think for many of our partners and our other nonprofit agencies in the area that we work with, I think we cannot hire fast enough. We are busier than ever. I just was looking at our fall 2021 numbers and found that our August and September numbers at our different food banks that we helped launch during the pandemic, we're having, I think, the highest amount of participants that we've had the whole pandemic, even from the first few months. So I think we're really still deep in it. I think for many people, the pandemic feels like it's lifting. And I think for us, the number of folks that we hear from on a daily basis that need support with food and rent assistance and their basic needs like diapers and formula are huge and are just as big as they were in April 2020. So for us, we're charging forward and in many ways continuing the same as we did in the beginning of the pandemic.
Thank you. And Dan, turning back to you just for a second, do you feel that funders have helped step up to underwrite the additional costs for construction and products, et cetera? Have you seen more governmental help? Now we're going into our second state budget where we're going to have even a larger windfall in government funds. How has that helped impact RCD's work?
In many ways, I do think it's a glass half full, half empty. And you can say that, government could have done some things better, but I think they've done a lot of things that have been really important for people. I think the eviction moratoriums, again, we were not going to evict people because that's not in our mission. Our folks were not going to be evicted for non-payment during this period. But across, society where people have landlords who aren't nonprofits, that's really critical to prevent homelessness. So I actually think government, the income supports for families to help make up for jobs that were lost. And then certainly all of the sort of stimulus programs. You mentioned the state budget. We, because of demand for affordable housing, have really been unable to start new projects in 2021, but the state was able to take some of the funding they got and with a budget surplus, was able to set aside almost $2 billion for stalled projects across the state. And we're going to be able to start at least 4 new construction housing developments in 2022, including 2 probably by February. So I think that government actually, when we look back, will say that we did respond. And we could always do better. I think there are certainly examples of programs where things maybe didn't happen as quickly as you'd have liked. But I feel that without that response that was really significant, there would have been a lot more pain across the people we serve.
Thank you. I'm going to turn back to you, Katie. Could you share with the audience a favorite moment of living there?
We've had a lot of residents to come and go. Not so many moved out, some passed away. But all in all, we still have some original 2006 residents there. And it's great. I love them. They love me. And we work together as a family. We're not a community, we're a family. And we help out each other in any way that we can. I must say that I am a leader in the building. Say, okay, it's Thanksgiving. Somebody may not get a Thanksgiving dinner. We need the full Thanksgiving dinner here to help, not so much as myself, but those that are less fortunate. So I push to get things that are needed in the building also. And they love me for that. They said, we don't have to worry. We know we're going to have this or we know we're going to have that because Katie lives here. So I love that. And I love working with each and every one of them.
Thank you. Very nice story. I'm going to turn back to you, Brian. And could you share with the audience what you feel has been one of the biggest impacts RCD has on our community, but also the residents, as well as the community outreach that you do?
Sure. I'll start with the community development work. So in our department, we have pretty recently created and been a part of launching a grassroots resident-driven organization in the Eden area that's called My Eden Voice. Part of our work in that space is that we fundamentally believe that those most impacted by inequality and poverty and housing instability and civic marginalization are the ones that should really lead the work. And it's really their voices that should be centered and should really be them at the center of all of our advocacy that we do. And that's what My Eden Voice is focused on. And so I'm really excited to be a part of this initiative. And I'm really excited that RCD is focused on building long-term capacity in the communities where we do work. And, we own over 70 buildings and are not going to probably be able to do intensive neighborhood and community development work everywhere. But it's really great in the Eden area that we are able to make such a kind of important, intensive investment in the people in this community, in their leadership skills, and in this organization that will hold this work moving forward.
And on the resident service side?
I think one of the things we always talk about at RCD is that our biggest focus in our services work is really keeping people housed. And a lot of our portfolio is housing for folks who are formerly homeless and unhoused. And we do all we can to provide them with everything they need beyond their housing to really make sure that they're able to thrive in place and remain long-term tenants of ours. And so I think every day that they continue to live successfully and stably in our buildings is a win for us and something that we're really proud of.
Thank you. Jen, coming to you from a global perspective, what do you feel has been RCD's biggest impact? And you obviously have impact across multiple communities.
I do see the housing production just being very impactful. Now we're housing over 5,000 people, and that's quite a responsibility, but it's quite an impact, particularly now that the housing crisis over the years has just gotten so much more challenging for so many more people. Homelessness has just exploded, and giving people just a place to live, as Brianne said, helping them stay and grow in their housing, the different types of people that we've been able to benefit. We work with, again, families that we've got kids who are going to college and coming back and seeing their parents who are in the housing, have been there a while. I think that housing is just fundamental, and it's unfortunately not really a right now in our country. And it's something that we need to work very hard to have more of so we can all be healthy and we can all have the kind of lives and the kind of communities that we should have in such a wealthy country that has the values that we say we do. So I think each time we're able to complete a housing development, which is often pretty challenging, it's very wonderful from my perspective. And again, it's a long-term thing. It's not a one-time thing. It can be a lifelong thing for the people fortunate enough to live there.
Dan, staying with that for a moment, and you may or may not have these numbers just at the top of your head, but I'm just thinking of the multiplier of building one of the RCD communities. So you've got the housing, the construction component of it, you've got the residents, you've got the services. Could you share a little bit about that?
It's funny. I don't necessarily have a multiplier number, but it's true that we provide jobs in the construction. I think there's probably well over 100 jobs that are created in construction, and our jobs do pay prevailing wage, so they're well-paid construction jobs. And I think also just in terms of the longer-term impact, I think that's really important because what we do is not cheap. And, one of the challenges is getting it financed and getting it built. These are buildings that are going to be there 100 years or more, right? They're buildings that are very well built, and they are buildings where people are going to have multiple generations of families and individuals, households will be in those buildings. So I think that when you look at when we build housing and preserve it, we just renovated essentially a 100-year-old hotel in downtown Oakland, that was basically a slum building. It was a building where people were living in horrible, deplorable conditions, and we were able to move in and keep it affordable. That, to me, there's a benefit of time, and that's just really important to think about in these investments.
Thank you. And Katie, coming to you, what do you feel has been the biggest impact of RCD's housing? You obviously sit on the board, but you're a resident. What do you feel has been the biggest impact on your fellow residents of being able to be a part of the RCD community?
It is an honor, really, to serve on the RCD board. I was so impressed when they said, would you like to be a board member? And I'm like, a board member? You're not serious? I know, because I didn't know anything about serving on boards. Even having worked with them, serving on a board is totally different. And I've learned a lot. I've supported RCD wholeheartedly. I am a resident, like I said, of 15 years. I'm a board member of almost that long and secretary of the board, but I've also been a spokesperson for RCD. The building we built in Martinez, I went before the Planning Commission to speak on behalf of RCD like 4 times, even spoke before the City Council in reference to that building. I also went to Sacramento and spoke. This was during the pre-development funds that we were trying to hold on to. And I spoke on the steps of the Capitol, representing RCD and other seniors and companies with affordable housing. So I've learned a lot, and I really do like it. I'm looking for a resident to replace me, but so far I haven't found one. I'm also chairman of the scholarship committee, where we solicit funds and award scholarships once a year at our annual event, Sparking Connections. So I've chaired that committee for a while now, and it's truly an honor and a pleasure at the same time.
Thank you. And Dan, coming back to you, for folks who are listening to the show today, how can they support RCD's work? Obviously, always nice to get a check. Are there ways that folks can get engaged, perhaps as a volunteer, or are you looking for partners, sponsors?
I'll say a couple things. One is, I think, just being aware of affordable housing opportunities and to support affordable housing in your community and not to oppose it. One of the biggest challenges we've had historically is, the not in my backyard kind of response to what we do. And thankfully, I think that's getting less, and I think politically tougher and tougher, but we still see lots of examples. So if you see that there's an affordable housing or project development to house homeless folks in your community, go to the council meeting. Now you just go on Zoom, write a letter, support it, or learn about it. So that's one thing. I think that's really important. And then, of course, you can always learn about us by going to our website, which is rcdhousing.org. You can follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn, and you can make a donation. That'll support all of our programs at rcdhousing.org/donate. So you can do that. But certainly that's very appreciated, and we love that. But I think just learning and supporting this type of work and being a welcoming neighbor in your community is very important.
Thank you. And Brianne, how can folks who are listening to the show support your efforts out in the community?
So in addition to the things that Dan mentioned, we are looking for volunteers. Folks can email me. My email's on our website. And we are specifically looking for volunteers right now, moving into 2022, that can help at our various food banks and support rent assistance distribution in the community. So we always appreciate volunteers and extra hands. And also love support with our advocacy work. We have a few different campaigns we're working on right now. One to expand renter protections in Alameda County. Another is our equitable recovery campaign, where we're really trying to push that we recover better from the pandemic and really try to drive more investments that are really going to support communities of color and low-income communities across Alameda County. So if you want to get involved, we're always looking for folks that can speak at public meetings and really be in partnership and in community with the residents and community members that we're working with.
Thank you. Staying with you, Brian, could you share with the audience one of your favorite moments of working in RCD and your community outreach efforts?
One of, I think, my favorite memories of working at RCD was the first successful policy campaign that we won was back in 2018. This was really kind of the first time that we'd brought together just a really diverse array of community members and partners and our residents to demand the Alameda County Board of Supervisors address the lack of civic representation in the area. And we really wanted the county to create a municipal advisory council. And we really felt like that would really be a game changer for the unincorporated communities. And for many community members, this was like their first time being at a public meeting and giving testimony and canvassing and door knocking and getting to know each other and designing their own campaign strategy. And I think that feeling in the air when we won, that coming together as a community was really the way to drive change and to really create stronger communities across the county. It's really always like a feeling that will stick with me and that compels me every day to keep working at RCD and to keep with our community development work.
Thank you. Nice story. And Dan, how about you? Favorite moment?
I think for me, and I touched on some of this before, it's really when we're able to complete a challenging housing development and finish it out and see the residents move in. I've been fortunate enough to see that happen a number of times. And Katie mentioned the development that she actually did advocate for us and courageously went in front of a community that was, quite skeptical, to say the least, about this building, which houses frail elders. And we were able to overcome a number of obstacles and open that building. And it's just a tremendously beautiful building. And at the grand opening, I had people, from the neighborhood who kind of looked at it and said, oh my goodness, this is just far nicer and completely not what we expected. Folks that were in the business community, the political leadership. And ultimately, after a while, it's just a wonderful community that I think everyone there is really proud of. So to me, that's really heartening. What we do, I think, is incredibly important. And to be able to get to those moments is wonderful.
Thank you. So segueing to our final question for all of you, and it'll be the same question. I'm going to start with you, Katie. From your perspective, what do you think are some of the positive things that can come out of the pandemic to support RCD's work and your fellow residents?
The pandemic in our building was different. The residents that lived there along with myself, they were glued to their apartments. They would not come out because they were so afraid of catching COVID. So they would stay in their apartments for days and just walk round and round. And some of them, their children would come over and take them out for a walk or whatever. But I don't know, I guess I was different. I stayed in for a while and then I began to mask up, glove up, and I was out. And when they saw that I was still going and not really staying in, that gave them a little spot. So they says, we could come out? Sure, you can come out. Just make sure you have your mask on. If you're worried about, put gloves on your hands or whatever, and sanitize. So I think it was an inspiration to some of them in the building to just come out of their apartments, because when you stay shut up in your apartment 7 to 10 days with nobody, you're just looking at the walls, it's different. It's truly different, because when the pandemic first hit, I had just gone to the doctor and we had lost a guy that lived in the apartment right next to me. And I was in the elevator with him the morning that he went to the emergency, and he never made it back, but we didn't know what he passed from. So my doctor says, you have to quarantine yourself for 14 days because we don't know if he had COVID. So I would wait until 10:30 or 11 o'clock at night to to go check my mail. And then I would have my mask and my gloves on and everything. As it turned out, he did not pass from COVID. But I had quarantined myself for 14 days just to be on the safe side. And just as I was coming out of it, the John Stewart Company had shelter in place. And I'm like, I've been in place for 14 days. I need to be out, but I survived it. And like I say, it was very different. And I was so glad when we were able to come back together as a community, when they lifted the ban and we could come back and we could go to coffee and sit down and share stories and like that. And everybody had a story to tell because they had been shut up in their apartments for so long. So it was great.
Thank you. Brianne, what do you feel are some of the good things that could come out of the pandemic?
I guess the first thing I'll bring up is that leaders in Alameda County, I think, are increasingly aware of the unincorporated communities. And I think a lot of that is because of the advocacy and the work that we've been doing. I'm excited that more and more people know about the needs of this community. And I think that the stimulus dollars that are being allocated will really be helpful for addressing the economic and health issues that were really there before the pandemic and that were really exacerbated by the pandemic. I think that is one thing that, quote unquote, positive that could come out of this situation. And I think that the other thing I would like to raise is that I think we really have some momentum now to address the systemic racism that's holding our communities back. I think the pandemic really highlighted a lot of the inequities in our society, in particular in the Bay Area. And we're really making, I think, some big progress in having a lot of conversations locally about increasing policies that really provide support for working families, that protect renters, and really center those who have been historically excluded from a lot of these programs and a lot of these conversations. So I guess I'm looking forward to that moving into 2022.
Thank you. And finishing off with you, Dan, from both an RCD perspective, but also you've been in the business for a while, more of a global perspective of how the pandemic has perhaps put a spotlight on our need for housing and lack thereof. What are some of the good things that could come out of it?
Yeah, certainly from an RCD perspective, I think we were tested and it showed the resiliency of the company in many ways. We thought about that in 2021 because I thought 2020 was a sort of an adrenaline year of crises that were really quick. In 2021, we've seen this just continue in ways that we can't predict. And it's going to obviously continue into 2022. So I think just the ability to be able to weather some of those storms and to bring different resources to bear, different ideas. One thing we didn't mention is that we vaccinated, 4,000 of our residents at our buildings, which was literally happening in one building right at the time when there was a COVID outbreak. And it was just incredibly new for us and fast. And so there was that sort of resiliency. And I think globally, I think Brianne kind of touched on it, that sadly, a lot of the issues that the pandemic really kind of heightened were happening before the pandemic. The health disparities, the housing disparities, the racial justice issues and disparities, they were all there. And it just shone a light and made things so much more out there and in some ways just much worse for many people, which was terrible. So hopefully some of the momentum that we've seen where there's just much more awareness, much more of a sense that we need to change some of our systems and new things and innovations that have occurred, things like the room key or home key program from the state where we're buying motels and turning it into housing, and we're participating in that. And that can be positive. We've seen that we're not powerless when we have a crisis, but we have to make sure that we mobilize and keep our energy and our politics in the right direction so that we're not caught short again.
Thank you. I want to thank Dan and Brianne for sharing resources for community development programs and services work today. I also want to thank Katie for sharing her experience with both living in a resources for community development complex as well as participating in its governance. We'll make sure that listeners have your contact information, your website, and your social media so they can apply for residency at a Resources for Community Development project and also get engaged in your work and to help our unhoused and our low-income community members find housing. So please stay safe and healthy as we all work our way through this new pseudo-normalcy.
Thank you very much.
It was an honor.
That's it for this episode of Voices of the Community. You've been listening to the voices of the Executive Director of Resources for Community Development, Dan Sawislak, and the Director of Community Development, Brianne Gala. along with Resident and Secretary of the Resources for Community Development Board of Directors, Katie Giles. To find housing, volunteer, and make donations, please go to rcdhousing.org. We hope that you enjoyed the insights, points of view, and personal stories from the voices of changemakers and their nonprofits and small businesses featured in this series. To find out more and get engaged with the nonprofits, small businesses, and staff members featured in the series, please go to my website, georgecoster.com, and click on Voices of the Community to find links to the extended versions of these interviews and to listen to the entire series. After listening to these stories, we hope that you will consider making a donation and volunteering to provide a hand up to your fellow community members. Today's episode was made possible by the audio wizard and our associate producer, Eric Estrada, and the graphics magic of Casey Nance from Citron Studios, along with the wonderful crew at the San Francisco Public Press and KSFP. Voices of the Community is supported by a grant from the James Irvine Foundation, dedicated to a California where all low-income workers have the power to advance economically. More at irvine.org. Voices of the Community is a member of Intersection for the Arts, which allows us to offer you a tax deduction for your contributions. Please go to georgecoster.com and click on the donate link to make a donation to help us provide future shows just like this one. While you're on our website, you can enjoy our archived past shows, which feature community voices working on solutions to critical issues facing Northern California communities. And you can sign up for our newsletter to find out more about future shows, as well as shows and events from the organizations that are included in our episodes. Take us along on your next COVID walk by subscribing to Voices of the Community on Apple Podcast, Spotify, and Google Podcast, or wherever you get your podcast. You can follow us on Twitter at George Coster, and we'd love to hear from you with feedback and show ideas, so send us an email to george@georgecoster.com. I'm George Coster in San Francisco, and thank you for listening.